mile and a half from the Nationals stadium. So I have to say it's been a good couple of weeks where I live. And baseball has been in the air, and this keynote has been on my mind. And the combination of the two, I think, had me remembering that late 1980s film Field of Dreams that Kevin Porter started, and that line that you probably remember from it, if you build it, they will come. In the movie, Kevin Costner's character has this wild dream to build a baseball diamond in the middle of his Iowa cornfield. The movie unfolds as he pursues that dream, and people think he's crazy and that he's going to financially ruin his family. I'm reducing the plot a lot, but it's a story of someone who imagined what no one else could see, and he relentlessly pursued that dream. And I suspect that you also have a story of chasing a dream in your own life. I hope that you do. So by way of introducing myself to you, I want to share one of those stories in my life. My first call was as a pastor in Fairfax City, Northern Virginia, outside D.C. And in Northern Virginia, the housing prices are incredibly expensive. So as a young professional, just out of seminary, I had a hard time finding a place that I could afford to live. And as I got settled in the community, I found that was true for a lot of people. It was true for the older adults who'd grown up in that city, lived there for decades, and were now finding that there was nowhere they could move in the city, because if they sold their current house, they wouldn't be able to afford anywhere else, and they needed to be on one level. Ida May was a woman in our congregation who cemented that in my mind as she talked about, every morning I sit at the top of my stairs and I think, what am I going to need today? Because I'm not going to come back up these stairs until bedtime. And she would come down and she would pray that she hadn't forgotten anything that she needed for her day. And she was stuck in this townhouse that she loved and couldn't move anywhere, staying in the city of Fairfax. And it was also true for other young professionals like me who were trying to live in the city and do their jobs. It was certainly true of any service workers, police, firefighters, nurses, teachers who served our community faithfully and couldn't afford to live there. So I started dreaming about the forested land right next door to our church and whether it could be developed and could be a garden-style apartment complex where folks like me and Ida May and the teachers and the police officers in our community could live and share life together in community. So I was 27 and thought I knew things. And I started meeting with nonprofit development companies and talking about this land. And I walked through the forest with them, and we talked about what would be possible here and how many units and what it would take, and spent the rest of the afternoon picking hitchhikers off of my suit pants. And I met with people in the zoning office in our city to learn what the zoning regulations would allow. And I talked with city council members about the possibility and the need for housing in our city. And I talked with church members who were neighbors, and everybody agreed with me that this would be a great idea for us to have some more affordable housing right next door to our church. A developer and I started working to figure out behind the scenes what the plans the city had for the land, and I was feeling really good about the progress we were making, and the apartments were becoming even more clear in my mind. I could see the older adults and the young families getting together and celebrating birthdays, and it was beautiful in my mind. And then one morning I drove to work, and there was a sign in front of the forest, new luxury townhomes starting at the 700s. And the next day the trucks came in. They started clear-cutting the forest. And now there's beautiful townhomes that people like me can't afford. And just like that, the dream that I had and been nurturing evaporated. And just like that, I learned a tremendous amount about power and privilege and how little it matters what the right thing is when there's financial gain to be had, and how strategic one has to be to get that kind of change that I want to see in the world and that I believe the gospel calls us to see in the world. So that's a story that helps you know a little bit about me, the dream that didn't come to pass, but I also have stories of dreams that did. Like my husband and I struggling with infertility for years before giving birth to a beautiful little boy almost 2 years ago. or leaving my comfortable associate pastor job to help start this organization of Next Church that has grown into Next Church, to support and equip congregations, to develop leaders, and to connect healthy tissue to healthy tissue around the PCUSA. So I want you to think for a moment and remember a time that you have chased a dream. It could be one that came true or one that didn't. But remember a time that you have chased a dream. Now I want you to turn to someone sitting near you and tell them that story briefly, and preferably turn to someone that didn't ride here in the same car as you this morning. And just take a couple of minutes and share those stories of those dreams that you have chased. And with those stories fresh in your mind, what does it feel like to chase a dream? What does it feel like? Do you think back to those times? Hopeful? Invigorating?
Risky?
Exhausting? Exciting? Prayerful? Challenging? Scary? Fun? I have a good bit of doubt along the way, usually. Collaborative? Some anguish? What? Long term, yeah. So some stubbornness, some stick-to-itiveness. Vulnerable, yeah. Say again? Insecurity, yeah. Yeah. What else? Is there another one? All of these things, I think, that we've just named are part of, they are the ingredients of a life of discipleship. They are the ingredients of a life of faith as we are trying to move toward that dream of the kingdom that Jesus talked about and promised. So the famous line from the Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come, I think that was the one that captured everyone's imagination because it was so spooky in the movie and it was whispered in the cornfield. But I wonder if the better mantra to have taken from that movie was one that I learned from community organizing, which is you can only build that which you can imagine. So Kevin Costner's character imagined what others could not perceive or see, this baseball diamond in the middle of the cornfield. And I wonder if the church has for years taken to heart the mantra, if we build it, they will come, and we're finding now that that's not true. If we put a building on the corner of 1st and Main and hire a full-time pastor and open our doors for worship at 11 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, they're going to come, right? If we hire a youth director, teenagers are going to flock to the church, right? If we put a nursery school in our basement, all the young families are going to start joining our church, right? Yeah. So in that same first call, I was the associate pastor for Christian formation, and so part of my job in that role was to oversee our children's ministry. And when I arrived, there were many beautiful stories and memories of the children's ministry where there were buku children, so many children, they didn't know what to do, and there was a choir program on Wednesday night that thousands came to, and they were so good that they toured around the Commonwealth of Virginia. And when I arrived, it was limping along with a dozen kids, and all the teachers and all the leaders were exhausted. But they had called this young new pastor, so it was going to be great. So the first year, I was like, all right, I think what we need here is a better curriculum. I think if we get a better curriculum, that's going to solve this problem. So the leaders of the children's ministry and I went over to the theological library and we read all the curriculums. We found a good one that resonated with the values and theology of our church, and we brought it in, and guess what? It didn't change anything. So the second year, we figured out, all right, our real problem was that our teachers don't feel equipped. So we're going to do better teacher training. So we spent the summer with multiple teacher gatherings. Some of them were relational, so they could get to know each other and feel like a team, and some of them were theologically and biblically driven, so they'd feel more confident in the teaching, and some of them was orienting them to the curriculum. And we started out this Sunday school year, and guess what happened? Nothing changed. And meanwhile, those precious 12 children that were coming did not like the snacks. And we were spending a lot of time in committee meetings discussing the freaking goldfish. And I kept saying, none of the children in this church are going to starve in the 2 hours they are here on Sunday morning. So, since I got really fed up with arguing about the snacks, we decided to do something different. And we started imagining. And we started imagining together as the children's ministry leaders. And we started imagining with the parents of the children in the church. And we started asking, what do you want for the development of your child's faith in this church? And what are you willing to commit to? Because it's not just what you want. It's what you're willing to get your children and your families here for. And the number one thing we heard over the course of that summer was that parents wanted adults in the congregation who knew their children well, who knew them as whole people, who knew what their interests were, who knew about their friends, who could ask them about school, who could hear what's hurting them, and to mentor them, to walk with them in faith and show them what a life of faith looks like. We also heard that they cared about their kids being in worship, and they cared about their kids learning some Bible study. Nobody cared about the snacks, it turned out. And we also heard some important things we needed to hear about a schedule that simply didn't work anymore for the families and the realities of their lives. So we ended up reorganizing the children's ministry, first around creating conditions where those deep relationships could form between adults and children. And second, we made some tweaks to the schedule, or we really actually reoriented it entirely. But it was really just technical changes to the schedule. And some things that experience taught me were that we had been in the mode of building for people and hoping to attract them. And we needed to shift to engaging them and asking them to help shape the ministry that they wanted. And there was a different level of ownership once we shifted our mentality about it. And secondly, we had spent the 2 previous years making lots of technical changes to the program when it was really an adaptive new paradigm that was needed. And third, through the process, we got really clear on why we were doing children's ministry. We got really clear that we were offering worship experience and recreation experience and music education and Sunday school for the children in our church, so that the children would be connected to adults who knew them in significant ways and could nurture them in faith by walking alongside them in their journeys and their daily lives. It became a matter of clarity for us and a matter of emphasis for us. So Next Church has developed a resource that's out on one of the tables outside. I encourage you to take a copy. It's called Cultivated Ministry. And it helps with this, getting this kind of clarity of why we're doing what we're doing in the church. One of the pieces of that guide is called the So That exercise. And all too often, I think we do activities in the church without a clear understanding of why we're doing what we're doing. So the So That exercise is very simple. It's we're doing X so that Y. It's very simple. We're doing X so that Y. And it's amazing how hard it is for us to answer that question succinctly and deeply. So I want you to take a few minutes and think about some activity in the life of your congregation, the life of your ministry, and jot down a so that statement. We do worship on Sunday morning, so that what? We do fantastic choir programs, so that what? We do an outreach to the homeless in our community, so that what? And what I want you to do is write down your first answer, and then I want you to interrogate it. What's the deeper answer? What's more under that? What's the theology that undergirds that? And keep going for a few minutes until you really feel like you've got a solid, we do X so that Y statement that you feel good about. So take a few minutes. Right? Yeah. So these are great examples, and I think what I hope you'll find, if you keep asking this question of yourself, that when you get clear on the so that, on the why that you do these things, it has this impact of sort of shaking free from some of the logistics that we often get caught in, and frees you up to think about the different ways you might accomplish that purpose. So if our purpose is to get strength from Christ, to stand against the world, well, that might mean singing 3 hymns and offering confession and hearing a sermon, but there are other ways to do that too. And so it frees us up to think differently about the things that we're doing and how we can most effectively get to that why that most matters in what we're doing. One last thing I learned from that children's ministry reorganization is that we were trying to recreate something from the past rather than engaging the present and imagining a different kind of future. And I think at the root of that was that our imaginations were too small. And I wonder if that isn't true for the church more generally right now. That we live in an age where church as we know it is in decline by all the traditional measures, and we don't like to admit it. But membership is down in the PCUSA in every mainline denomination. But the last time the PCUSA had a net membership growth was when Lyndon Johnson was president. Almost every church I know has a budget challenge. Regular church attendance means people come to worship once or twice a month now. Our buildings are aging. These gorgeous buildings are aging and becoming a problem for us as much as they are a resource for us. Once the church was the center of the community, and now we're being pushed aside or at worst ignored by the community. And nuns, you've heard the statistic that the nuns are on the rise, and not the Catholic nuns, but those who check none on religious affiliation on surveys. They're now a full quarter of adults in the U.S. population say they have no religious affiliation, and a full 1/3 of adults under 30 say that. Scholars smarter than I am say that we are living through a significant cultural shift that includes religion, but is much bigger than religion. It has to do with technology and communication and diversity and globalization and economics and education and psychology and political divisiveness. It encompasses every part of our lives. And I don't know about you, but the change in culture feels overwhelming to me a lot of the time. And it's difficult to navigate. And it comes at me faster than I can figure out how to manage it. So in this season, I think just as people, when we're feeling overwhelmed, even if there's also opportunity that we can see in the midst of all this change, it feels overwhelming, and it's easy to become insular and to turn inward, to shore up, to circle the wagons, to double down on what we've always done. And it's easy to fall into grief and despair and to long for the sweet used-to-bes and to slip into wishful thinking about what might be again. And we start wishing for things like full offering plates and standing room only on Sunday morning. And we imagine classrooms overflowing with children and teenagers who want to come to worship and millennials who tithe. And none of those things would be bad. Those would be great things. But perhaps they're also too small. Our imaginations are too small. Because if I stop and think about what keeps me up at night, what motivates me to get involved with things, it's not wanting pews full on Sunday morning. It's not learning more about the book of Matthew or 1 Thessalonians, as important as knowing Scripture is. The things that keep me up at night are the reality that in the last 3 weeks in my neighborhood there have been 2 fatal shootings and a gun shootout on a Tuesday afternoon on a street I walk down regularly. I don't want that kind of community for my son or any of our children. The things that keep me up at night are feeling tremendous gratitude for the wonderful African-American women who love and nurture my son at daycare for 8 hours every day, and the reality that they are nurturing a class full of white children. The things that keep me up at night are the weight that we're feeling in my family as we watch my mother-in-law diminish each week as cancer ravages her body and treatments are not working. It's the dread I feel about the environmental havoc we're creating, and the fear, the very real fear I feel for my son and all of our children that they're going to bear the brunt of our recklessness. These are the things that keep me up at night, and they're things I care about because of the convictions the church has taught me. And I love my congregation, and I love this denomination, and I've not too often found ways that are particularly meaningful that my congregation is leading me to address these things that matter most to me and keep me up at night. That's right. So maybe our imaginations have been too small. Maybe our future isn't in bringing back those things that were, but in imagining new things. You can only build what you can first imagine. And I think that's what the prophets invite us to do. Think about Amos's declaration that justice will roll down like waters, Micah's vision that swords will be beaten into plowshares and no one will be made afraid. I think of Jeremiah calling the people to seek the welfare of the city where they are, even as they are exiles in that city. I think of Isaiah saying that the blind will see and the imprisoned are set free. And it's not just the prophets, right? It's Mary singing about the poor being filled with good things, and Paul's teaching to let faith and hope and love abide, and John's revelation of the Lamb on the throne, and Jesus' teaching of the kingdom of God over and over and over. Our faith invites us to imagine big things. Not to wish away what is, but to take what we have and to imagine new things. It makes me think of Apollo 13. I apparently am on like this old movie kick right now. But do you remember in that movie, which is the true story, that there was the fire and the oxygen system wasn't working, and they had to figure out with all the materials they had on the shuttle, the space shuttle, how they can make a new oxygen supply to keep these astronauts alive and get them safely home. And I think that's our task as the church right now. We've got amazing resources at our disposal. We do have these amazing buildings. Even when they're falling down, they're amazing resources. We've got networks of people who are engaged in the world in significant and important ways. We've got rich theology and rich traditions. We've got amazing people in our pews. We've even got money. It is there. We have it. And what we need, I think, is a creative spark, the imagination to dream up new things that might be. Elizabeth Gilbert, the author, has written a book, Big Magic, which I actually haven't read, but she did a great interview with Krista Tippett on being, so I listened to that. And I commend it to you. But she says that the secret to creativity and to imagination is choosing the path of curiosity instead of the path of fear. Choosing the path of curiosity instead of the path of fear. And there's an important caution to this imagining. There's a brilliant book on leadership called Emergent Strategy that I forgot to send for the resource list. But Adrienne Marie Brown wrote this book called Emergent Strategy. And she says that we are in an imagination battle right now. She writes, Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown and Renisha McBride and so many others are dead because in some white imagination they were dangerous. Imagination has people thinking they can go from being poor to be a millionaire as part of a shared American dream. Imagination turns brown bombers into terrorists and white bombers into mentally ill victims. Imagination gives us borders, gives us superiority, gives us race as an indicator of capability. We have to imagine beyond these fears, Brown writes. We have to ideate, to imagine and conceive together. It's collaborative imagination that we need, she argues. What are the ideas that will liberate all of us? That's the goal of our imagining. To imagine together, what are the ideas, the imaginations that will liberate all of us? So you can only build what you first imagine, but don't imagine alone. Imagine together as the collective people, which is such a Presbyterian thing to say, isn't it? We're a priesthood of all believers. We believe in communal discernment. We believe the Spirit speaks best when we do that together in shared power. So for the few minutes we have left this morning, I want to share with you some of the things that I have seen around the church that are new ways of imagining, new ways of being church, in hopes that they will spark your own imagination and encourage you to get curious about what might be possible in your own context, and invite other people to get curious with you. So there is a group called Build that's doing some amazing work in Baltimore, in the Oliver neighborhood of Baltimore, which is a predominantly African-American neighborhood in Baltimore that has been, it's a neighborhood of row houses which have been the victims of urban decay for many years now, drug dealers owning the streets and homes falling down. You can picture The Wire, that's where it was filmed. 10 years ago, the churches in the Oliver neighborhood started talking to the residents of their neighborhood and asking, what do you think has gone wrong here? And what do you wish this neighborhood could be? And what do you dream it could be? And the churches and the residents banded together and raised their own money and then leveraged that collective power and got corporate folks involved. And then they created a redevelopment fund that has allowed them to gut and rebuild these homes in Oliver and to sell or rent them at affordable rates without gentrifying the neighborhood, which is almost unheard of. And the demand for these beautifully renovated and redeveloped homes is huge. And because they've done it as a community, they're able to sell and rent them, and they have a ridiculous, it's like a 98% retention rate of people in these homes. It's amazing. And the neighborhood is being flooded with families and couples who want better for their lives than drug-infested streets. So they were honest about the brokenness in the neighborhood. They remembered the promises of God. They banded together and they imagined a new thing. And those imprisoned in a decaying neighborhood were set free. Another example is that 10 years ago in Herndon, Virginia, the immigration debate had come to a head. The town was deeply divided about the migrant workers who gathered at the 7-Eleven each morning to look for work. So two Presbyterian churches, Trinity and Riverside, joined together to welcome the strangers in their midst, and it was not a popular decision. They invited the immigrants to come have lunch at their church, and they even went to the 7-Eleven and picked them up in their cars. And slowly, word got out among the immigrants that these churches were welcoming them in, and now 100 people gather every Wednesday for lunch, for fellowship, and for a worship service in Spanish. They were honest about the complicated realities. They remembered the promises of God. They came together and they imagined something new. So imagine that. A church welcomes the stranger and a new worshiping community is born. There's a church in North Carolina that was having a hard time getting adults to attend any Christian education that they were doing. When one of the leaders noticed that it felt like there was an inordinate number of families who were facing cancer diagnoses and treatments in their congregation. So they decided to create a semester-long class on facing cancer with faith. And the leadership brought all the resources of our faith to bear on the conversation, and I'm told they had to move the class 3 different times because it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger because they were talking about the things that were keeping their people up at night. So imagine that, a church that gets curious about the lives of its people and finds new ways of forming faith. There's a small church out west that invested a lot of resources into a nursery hoping to attract young families to the church on Sunday mornings, and it didn't work. But they realized they had this amazing resource now, so they started inviting parents and children to come for play groups during the week. And now they have a robust rock and toddlers ministry with the church, embracing hospitality and inviting the community. And they've created this network now of young parents who feel welcomed, who feel seen, who have each other to lean on. There's a church in Kalispell, Montana, who has a really unique ministry called Serious Juju. And for years, that church struggled with these teenagers skateboarding in their church parking lot and on their property. And they tried signs and fences and calling the police to remove these kids. And one day, a lawyer in the congregation, who was the most aggrieved by the skateboarders, saw one of the kids in court. The young teen had been kicked out of his broken home by his mother. This lawyer had what he describes as a Damascus moment. The scales fell from his eyes, and he realized that these kids were not vandals. They were simply trying to find a safe place to be. So the lawyer spent the next several years building up a ministry for these skateboarding kids, these homeless teens. And now it's this youth group called Serious Juju. Imagine that. Those who are imprisoned are instead nurtured and cared for and taught the stories of faith. There's a small church in rural Indiana who recognized that many of their neighbors were struggling with paying basic bills, utility bills, rent bills, and coming to the church to ask for financial assistance. And as the church started to get overwhelmed by the number of requests, they started digging in a little bit deeper with some of these folks of what was going on, and they realized that almost everyone who came in was dependent on check cashing services that took out a huge percentage, and people would get stuck in the debt of that system. So the church became a place to cash checks without fees and without interest. so people could keep their money and better afford to cover their bills. Imagine that. Church creatively using its resources to loosen the bonds of economic injustice. You can only build what you can imagine. And there's all kinds of imagination happening around. You all are doing it here. So I encourage you to continue to practice that with one another. Talk to one another. Imagine. And you're going to come up with some great ideas. And you're going to come up with some terrible ones. And that's okay too. So what I want us to do for the last few minutes that we have, we're going to take 2 minutes. And what I want you to do is turn to someone next to you and just for 2 minutes, do a what-if exercise. What if our church sold the building and gave all the money to, I don't know what. What if? All the crazy. And your job, it's hard, is to not squash the ideas, to just say, what if? Just say, what if? Don't explain them, just ask what if. 2 minutes. Go. Okay, wrap up. You need more than 2 minutes, I know. But you can play this game anytime. Wouldn't it be fun to do this at the start of a committee meeting? Or a session meeting? Or a committee on ministry meeting? So we're not going to get to these what-ifs by dreaming them up right here. We're going to get to them by being curious, by paying attention, by expanding who you know and learning about each other's lives and imagining beyond our fears. And imagine how we can act together to build the kind of community that we want to live in and how we can be a blessing to one another. And to build a community together that looks ever more like the kingdom of God that Jesus promised. So all of those things that we talked about at the beginning of what it feels like to pursue a dream, the fear, the hope, the hard work, the anxiety, the vulnerability, they're all true. And I was wrestling with a good bit of that myself this week as we're going through tumultuous stuff in our work. And I'm convinced that the Holy Spirit was up to something when a friend of mine shared this story with me, so I'm going to share it with you as in closing. My friend Becca's mom has just been diagnosed with esophageal cancer, and it's advanced, and she's starting treatment, but she's declined rapidly. So Becca describes their family right now and the grief and the fear as walking barefoot through the world right now, feeling all the stones and the roots along the way. And I know what she means by that image, and I bet you do too. And Becca's mom called last week to say hello and update her on their treatment. And after chatting a while, Becca said she needed to go, that she needed to finish her sermon on how Christians live in hope in the face of death. And her mom said, it's true, you know. It's true that you can be frightened and hopeful at the same time. That's a real thing. You start off being opposed and resisting and wanting to quit, she said, but then hope comes around and grabs you and says, wait a minute, think about it. And here's the clincher. She said, it's God's grace. Perhaps you've heard of that, dear. It's God's grace. Perhaps we've heard of that, church. We're in a tricky spot as a church, as a country, as a planet, but being frightened and hopeful happen at the same time. And we can choose to lean into that hope, to choose the path of curiosity over the path of fear, to imagine new things together with one another and with our neighbors, and then work our tails off to make those new things come into being. And in the midst of that, I know that we will experience